Good morning. First of all, can I apologise? I know you should never start a presentation with an apology, but as you can hear, I'm going down with a horrible cold, so if I do sound a bit croaky, apologies. Okay, I always like to start off these presentations by asking who's actually heard of the Freight Transport Association. Okay, that's about average. We actually represent everybody here, pretty much. We're very much involved in road transport, air transport, all the different modes. And one of the things that we have to compete with is whenever somebody talks about road transport, they always think about the Road Haulage Association. We're much more about freight, and that includes all the parcels and everything that you're involved with. Okay. The urban logistics policy role is a relatively new one. We have up until now been mostly split into regional areas. As the Chair said, I was looking after London's South East. And what we've recognised now is that there are consistent themes across all the urban areas in the UK, so not just London, but in Birmingham, in Manchester, in Leeds, in Sheffield, all of these places. And what we're trying to do is to roll out the best practice of what we've achieved in the last few years into all of those areas so that we don't find ourselves reinventing wheels. So, again, who we are, we're multimodal. We represent the operators of about half the UK's HGV fleet, so all of the large companies are in membership, and we represent the operators of about 1 million vans, so that's quite a big number, and 14,000 members in total. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about trends, as all of our other speakers have done. The first thing that's very obvious is the trends from moving from heavy goods vehicles to vans. You'll all be aware that vans are much less heavily regulated, whether that's in terms of the driving standards, in terms of the maintenance, in terms of the speed restrictions. And in fact, we were just talking at one of our freight councils yesterday, in fact, about the new speed restrictions for heavy goods vehicles over 3.5 tonnes. And all of these factors are driving people into using vans more. Of course, the way that the Department for Transport responds to this is to say, well, vans have been too unregulated for too long, so we have the big spectre of more regulation coming in the van sector, whether that's about the vehicles, about their maintenance and operation, or about the way that they're driven and the driving standards that we have. There's also a trend towards larger vehicles, and you'll all be aware when you're driving around you see double-deck trailers, and we're also talking at the moment to the department about longer semi-trailers. The longer, heavier vehicle that you hear talked about, the sort of super monster truck, I don't think it's going to happen here anytime soon, because most of you will know it's not more weight that you need more volume. But it's quite likely we'll see longer semi-trailers coming along fairly soon. Now, it's been interesting hearing all the other speakers talking about increasing fulfilment and increasing customer expectations and how that's all going to be done. Within London, there's a rather different challenge, and that is that the London plan sets out a target of 800,000 more people in the next 10 years, 600,000 more jobs. Now, that's a lot of business that you guys are going to have to support. At the same time, that means there are more buses, so there's more restrictions on curbside access. I'll come back to that later on. There are other restrictions in place about nighttime movements of vehicles, and they all need to be looked at as well. One of the other big areas that we're looking at is air quality. And it's been interesting because people talk about the problems about air quality and particulates. Well, more particulates got dumped in the UK in the last week than were emitted by the UK fleet probably in the last 10 years. But we can't compete with that. But there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on looking at how to drive down emissions, and that's all tied into your replacement programme for your vehicles. The last thing I've got on that list for the moment, I've got a few more things on my sheet here, is about the growth in cycling. Now, you might see cycling as an opportunity, you might see it as a threat, but again, in the London plan, the Mayor is talking about cycling, which has already doubled in the last 10 years, doubling again. And you might say, well, that's great, there's fewer vehicles on the road. What that means is more cycle superhighways, more cycle lanes, potentially the threat of further reduced access to the curbside, because you'll see there are some cycle superhighways being put in at the moment, one on the A23, one on the A13. And at the moment, there's no change to the curbside access. But what the Mayor and Transport for London have said is if the scheme doesn't work well, then the remaining 10 cycle superhighways will have additional loading restrictions, which is not what you want at all. You would not like to be banned from loading between 7 and 10 in the morning. A couple of other things in terms of trends. One is penalty charge notices, which you might think is fairly dry. It is a big issue for the courier sector. The good news is that penalty charge notices have been going down. We've done a huge amount of work. We actually set up a millionaires club a few years back, which is people whose businesses were receiving penalty charge notices of more than £1 million a year. Now, we've actually just disbanded that because the companies that were in that club have all reported that their PCNs have fallen quite dramatically. If any of you have still got a problem with PCNs, then come and talk to me about how I can help you with that, because there are lots of things that you can do to help drive that cost down. It's basically just pouring money down the drain, isn't it? And the only other thing I have here is about flight controls. Again, it seems a strange thing to be talking about today when we've only just started flying again. But clearly one of the issues is about, well, many of the issues about noise and about air quality around the airports. And clearly the last thing you want is additional nighttime restrictions, places like Stansted and Luton, because that's going to dramatically affect your ability to service your 9 AM deliveries. So, talking about noise first of all, noise isn't particularly a problem for vans, but I'm sure that most of you have got larger vehicles involved in trunking operations. We've been working very closely with the Noise Abatement Society, and what we're trying to do is to identify locations where an out-of-hours or nighttime delivery would be of benefit to you. It's something that typically benefits the grocery and retail sector more, and the trials that have been done so far have been with people like Sainsbury's. But I do know that most of the courier companies who are doing trunking operations have to send, for example, their large vehicles on very long, circuitous routes around London every night in order to get from A to B, because they're not allowed to go on the shortest route. And what we're trying to do is find out how we can showcase quieter vehicles. We're working very closely with the Department for Transport on how we can do that. So I talked about air quality. This is a bit of a mixed up slide, this, I apologise for that. If I start in the middle with vehicle choices, that might be about the size of vehicle that you're using, it might be about the choice of fuel that you're using. And you'll all be aware that the Mayor is pushing very much for electrical vehicle infrastructure. Excuse me. Unfortunately, that's great if you've got a car and you're going to park your car in London all day and it can trickle charge all day. It doesn't really work if you've got electric vehicles, whether that's a van or a small HGV, which needs half an hour to charge up, and you're not normally going to be on site for that long. So there's various issues like that. And we've seen things like LPG come and go, because LPG was going to be the next best thing, and then the taxation regime changed and it suddenly wasn't a good idea anymore. And what we're trying to make sure is that when we're talking to the Treasury, when we're talking to the Mayor, whenever we talk about electrical vehicle infrastructure, we say, well, can we have some cast iron guarantees, please, that if we invest in electric vehicles, that you will guarantee that the tax regime won't get changed as soon as it looks like you're going to make a bit more money out of it. I'll talk about the low emission zone. The thing that affects most of you here, I should imagine, is phase 3 of the low emission zone in 2012. Now, I don't know if anybody here is familiar with, I know one or two people are familiar with Euro standards. The Euro 3 standard is a standard that came in 2001. So this shouldn't be something that you have to worry about, because essentially in 2012, you won't be able to use vehicles that are more than 11 years old. Now, I don't know how many of you here are using vehicles more than 11 years old. Not that many, I should imagine. More challenging targets for HGVs. The Euro 4 has been around for a couple of years, but it's still not that widely taken up. Excuse me. The problem we have is that nationally, we're not meeting our air quality targets for oxides of nitrogen, for NOx. On particulates, that's the soot, we're okay. We're not there yet, but there's a very definite downward trend. And the risk is that somebody like the Department for the Environment will say, well, actually, what we'll do is we'll just add one onto all of these numbers. So 2012 becomes Euro 4 for vans and Euro 5 for HGVs. Now, it's not likely, but just have to have that in the back of your mind, that if that happened, you'd be talking about significant vehicle replacement requirements. So we're working on that. Of course, the other way to drive down the emissions from vehicles is in the way that you use them. And there's a lot of work going on about eco-driver training at the moment. For those of you who follow driver management, there's something called the Driver Certificate of Professional Competence for HGV drivers. Now, We're actually, as we speak, having a discussion about whether eco-driving training should be mandatory for those drivers. And what you probably want to know is how are we going to push greener driving for your drivers. Part of the way we're going to do that is we're also looking at van driver qualifications. At the moment there aren't any. But what we want to do is to get a van driver qualification established industry-wide in order that we, if Department for Transport comes back and says we need to regulate you, we can say, well, here's a scheme that we already have up and running, and then it's well supported. And we've been working very closely with a number of our members and also with the Driver Standards Agency to get a voluntary van driver qualification into place. And I'm sure that you would all welcome that, having your drivers having some accredited level of training, which would include things like defensive and eco-driving, which would be driving down your costs, whether that's in terms of the direct fuel cost or whether it's about things like insurance premiums. And we have seen companies who've driven down their collision rate by 90%, and it does wonders for your insurance premiums. And the other thing we have here is Van Excellence. FTA is leading a piece of work again with a number of its member companies on identifying what works best in the van sector and how we can help other van operators to take up that best practice. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to say best practice is what the competition does, but best practice with a small b and a small p, to help you to see how other operators are benefiting from those things. Excuse me. The last thing I just wanted to talk about was curbside access. I've mentioned penalty charge notices. What you will have seen is that for those of you stopping at the curbside, that curbside limit has been raised from 20 minutes up to 40 minutes in the last 18 months. And that's something where we found that, for a single delivery, 20 minutes is more than enough, but quite often you had people stopping at the curbside to make multiple drops. And of course, it's ridiculous that in the 19th minute you're legally stopped and the 21st minute you get a ticket. So we've pushed that up to 40 minutes, and a lot of our members have said that that's made a huge impact on their bottom line. And driver management. Those of you who are managing your drivers, I'll give you an example of a brown van company and a yellow van company. I won't name names, but you can work it out. The yellow van company said to its drivers, if you get a ticket, you can pay. And the brown van company said, hand it over, we'll pay it for you. Now, guess which company got more tickets? The brown van company, by a country mile. And when the brown van company started to introduce driver management and said it was a disciplinary offence to continue to get PCNs like this, strangely the problem evaporated. So for all this that it's about vindictive traffic wardens and all these other things, the reality was that when people started managing their drivers more effectively, a lot of the penalty charge notices went away. Something that I haven't heard talked about today is delivery and servicing plans. If you talk to Transport for London's freight unit, they're very keen to have DSPs rolled out. And this is essentially saying, if you're going to go to premises regularly, why don't you just take 5 minutes to work out where you're going to stop in order to make sure that you're there legally? Because what you don't want is that everybody arrives at 9 o'clock to make their deliveries. Now, part of that is about if multiple companies go to the same location. Of course, there is the bête noire of cooperation and how you're all going to cooperate with each other. Because what Transport for London were like is that you split London up into zones and say, right, UPS is responsible for that zone and DHL is responsible for that zone. Now, I know you've all got issues about entrusting the last mile to another carrier, but the reality is something's going to have to be done. If you can't have 600,000 more jobs in the city, you can't have 800,000 more people in London, you can't have all this increased customer expectations unless you start thinking about some radical ways of working. And I've covered the cycle superhighways already, so I shan't talk about that anymore. That's it from me. Thank you.